Okay, so we all learned to read back in school, right? But dealing with all the reading and writing life throws at you as an adult, it's like a whole other level of challenge. And for some people, those skills we learned, they can still be, well, a bit of a struggle, even if it's not always obvious. Today, we are going to take a deep dive into adult dyslexia. And to guide us, we have this amazing resource called What is Adult Dyslexia? A Guide for Dyslexic Adults. And it's written by Mikala Perry.
Oh, this guide. It's brilliant, like truly insightful, because it comes straight from someone who gets it, like really gets adult dyslexia, Mikala. She's dyslexic herself and she's studying cognitive science, so she's coming at this from, all angles. But what makes this guide so special is that it's not just like dry academic stuff, it's all shaped by her own journey, her own experience, trying to understand how her brain works ever since she was diagnosed at 8 years old.
Yeah, exactly. So in this deep dive, we're going to really explore what dyslexia is at its core. We'll take a quick trip back in time and see how our understanding of it has, evolved. But most importantly, we're going to look at how dyslexia actually shows up for adults. We're talking about those hidden challenges, the stigma, and the incredibly creative ways people have figured out how to navigate all of it. So whether you've ever wondered, could dyslexia be part of my story? Or you just want to understand it better, you are in the right place.
And it is so fascinating to see how far we've come in our understanding. I mean, way back when they used to call dyslexia word blindness.
For blindness.
Yeah, but that term, it really doesn't capture the whole picture, does it? We'll get into it more later, but our thinking about dyslexia has really shifted, from that initial focus on visual processing to a much more nuanced understanding of, the role of how we process sounds in language, as well as other cognitive functions. It really shows you how many different areas of research, come together to help us understand this.
Okay, so let's start with Mikalala's own definition of dyslexia from the guide. She describes it as something that's often passed down in families, so hereditary. And it's a specific learning disability, meaning it's rooted in how the brain is wired. But here's the key thing. It makes reading and writing less efficient, but it has absolutely nothing to do with someone's intelligence.
Oh, 100%. That is so crucial to remember. Dyslexia is not about intelligence. And, a lot of the early research focused primarily on kids, which makes Mikalai's focus on adults, her perspective on how this affects them, even more valuable, don't you think?
Absolutely. And the history that she lays out, it's really interesting. Way back in 1878, that's when they first observed this thing they called word blindness.
Wow, 1878.
Yeah, and then a few years later, in 1883, the term dyslexia was officially coined. And initially, like you were saying, they thought it was mainly a problem with how people process words visually.
And what's so wild is how quickly that initial understanding started to, broaden. By 1891, a French neurologist, he made this connection between dyslexia and certain areas in the left side of the brain, areas that are involved in reading. That was a huge turning point because it started to reveal the neurological basis of dyslexia. And then fast forward to the 1980s, the field of linguistics, especially the idea of generative phonology, that had a huge impact, bringing in this whole idea of how we mentally work with the individual sounds in words, the phonemes.
Right, that focus on the sounds within words, like being able to break down, say, the word cat into its individual sounds, K-A-T, that became a fundamental piece of the puzzle in understanding dyslexia. And Michaela, she even throws in the words etymology for us. Dys in Greek means difficulty, and lexis means reading. So even the roots of the word itself point to this core challenge with reading.
And she brings up a really important point about, how science actually works. It's not about finding absolute proof for something. It's about gathering more and more evidence that supports a theory, seeing how well a theory explains what we're observing. And because dyslexia research draws from so many different fields like neurology, linguistics, psychology, you have all these experts, right, looking at different aspects of the same thing, but through their own, specialized lenses.
Which kind of explains why there isn't just one simple, universally agreed upon explanation for dyslexia. Instead, what we have are these different theories, each trying to explain different parts of how it shows up. So let's dive into those, starting with the phonological theory, which seems to be a really central one.
It is. The phonological theory really boils down to this idea that for people with dyslexia, there's a difficulty in processing those individual speech sounds, the phones. It's not just about hearing them, but how our brains represent those sounds, what's called phonological awareness. And this theory suggests that this difficulty with the sounds of language, well, it can make it harder to read, to spell, and sometimes even to hear the differences between spoken words clearly.
Oh, that's interesting. So if you've ever, like, struggled to learn a new language, where you have a hard time hearing the subtle differences between similar sounds, this theory suggests that something similar might be happening for people with dyslexia when they're trying to connect those written letters to the spoken sounds in their own language.
Exactly. And it goes even deeper than that. It affects their ability to hold those sounds in mind and like manipulate them in their short-term memory, their working memory. Think about sounding out a long word.
Yeah.
You have to hold all those sounds in your head as you work your way through the word. For someone with these phonological processing challenges, that can be a real struggle. And that, of course, affects how smoothly they can read, how well they understand what they've read, and even how accurately they can write those sounds down when they're spelling. But then we also have the visual theory, which looks at dyslexia from a whole other angle.
And just to clarify, this isn't about having good eyesight or bad eyesight, right? Mikala makes it really clear that it's about how the brain actually processes the visual information coming from those letters and words on the page.
You got it. Research that uses eye tracking, it's actually shown that when people with dyslexia are reading, their eyes tend to make more jumps, what are called saccades, and they fixate or stop on the page more often compared to non-dyslexic readers. So that suggests that there might be some differences in how their visual attention works during reading. And some researchers even propose that this could be related to differences in certain brain cells called magnocellular cells. These cells, they help process visual information, especially movement and contrast.
It's like a subtle difference in how the brain is taking in and interpreting those visual signals, the letters and words on the page. And then there's the cerebellar theory, which looks at a part of the brain that we usually associate with, like physical coordination and movement.
Exactly. The cerebellum, it sits at the back of the brain, close to the spinal cord. It's super important for things like coordinating our movements and making those skills feel automatic, like, riding a bike. And the cerebellar theory basically proposes that difficulties with things like having neat handwriting, learning to drive, even reading, they can be connected to how the cerebellum functions. And that's because all those activities, they involve a sequence of coordinated movements that ideally become automatic over time.
It's so interesting to think about something like reading, which feels so mental, actually having this connection to motor skills. But like Mikala emphasizes, and this is a really important point, none of these theories can fully explain all the different ways dyslexia can show up.
You hit the nail on the head. It's much more likely that these different theories, the phonological, the visual, the cerebellar, and maybe even others we haven't talked about, they all play a role, contributing in different ways to how diversely dyslexia can manifest. It's different for everyone.
All right, so now we have a better grasp of what dyslexia is and some of the main ideas about why it happens.
Yeah.
So let's shift gears a bit and talk about how this actually plays out in adulthood. Mikala makes a really good point that while those reading challenges might still be there, other issues also come to the forefront, like dealing with the stigma, developing all sorts of clever compensation strategies, and even facing difficulties with things like planning and organization.
And that shift in focus, it's so important. Because a lot of adults with dyslexia, they've developed all these skills and strategies to navigate the everyday demands of reading and writing. So the focus often becomes about their overall experience, living with what is often an invisible disability.
That invisibility, it's really a double-edged sword, as Mikala points out. On the one hand, it gives adults with dyslexia the choice of whether or not they want to disclose their condition. And that can help them avoid a lot of those outdated and often just wrong stereotypes, those assumptions people make about intelligence or ability.
Right. There can be real advantages to keeping that information private, especially because, unfortunately, there's still stigma around learning differences. However, the flip side is that when it's not obvious to others that someone is putting in extra effort, that they're approaching things differently, all that hard work can go totally unnoticed. And that can make it much tougher to ask for accommodations at work or in school. People might not fully grasp what it's actually like to navigate the world with dyslexia.
And the research Mikala cites really highlights this. Dyslexic adults often report having less positive experiences with, like universities and support services, compared to people with more visible disabilities. There's even this feeling that whether or not they got the help they needed sometimes depended more on their personality than on a genuine understanding of their disability.
That's really disheartening to hear. It just shows how difficult it can be to advocate for yourself when your struggles aren't readily apparent. And it can sadly lead to people feeling like they need to hide their dyslexia, even if it means not getting the support that could make a real difference. Mikala even shares this really powerful example of someone who would make up elaborate dietary restrictions just to avoid having to read a restaurant menu out loud.
Oh, wow. That really brings it home. You can really see the everyday hurdles and the lengths people will go to keep their dyslexia hidden. And Mikala also talks about the emotional impact all this secrecy can have. Many dyslexic adults report feeling, like they're not reaching their potential, feelings of loss, even failure. And that is so far from the truth.
It's such a heavy burden to carry, all that in silence. And she introduces this concept of constructed failure to really explain this.
Yeah.
And I think it's a really insightful way to look at how external barriers and societal expectations can contribute to those internal feelings of not being good enough, not measuring up.
And she breaks it down into a few different types of failure. There's public failure, which is all that pressure to have strong reading and writing skills in all sorts of everyday situations, like reading important documents, following directions, filling out applications. And then there's system failure, which is the lack of consistent, adequate support systems, in education and the workplace. That can really limit opportunities.
And don't forget family failure, which can happen when someone's family environment isn't supportive, like when family members don't understand or acknowledge the real challenges of dyslexia. And lastly, there's that personal failure, that internal feeling of inadequacy, which can stem from constantly facing stigma and having to overcome so many hurdles.
So you're really getting this multi-layered picture of how these feelings of failure can actually be created by those external factors.
Mm.
But Mikala also offers a really hopeful counterpoint with this idea of candid dyslexics. These are the people who are open and honest about their dyslexia.
Yes, and research suggests that they might be a smaller part of the dyslexic population, but their impact is significant. When they share their experiences, they become these incredibly important role models, especially for those who might be closeted, keeping their dyslexia private or even confused, meaning they haven't yet recognized or understood that dyslexia might be part of their own story. To see someone else living successfully and openly with dyslexia can be so empowering.
Absolutely. And Mikala emphasizes that these candid dyslexics, they're also actively helping to break down those external barriers by speaking up for themselves, asking for accommodations, challenging those outdated negative perceptions. They're really like agents of change in how we understand dyslexia. But she also acknowledges that not everyone feels safe or comfortable disclosing their dyslexia, and that deciding when or if to do so is a deeply personal choice.
And that brings us to the idea of compensatory strategies, right? Mikala stresses how important it is to develop these often really ingenious strategies. It's another way that adults with dyslexia navigate their challenges, whether or not they choose to disclose it. And research shows that both kids and adults with dyslexia, they naturally find ways to adapt to tasks they find more difficult.
It's interesting how those strategies might change as we move from childhood to adulthood. Mikala contrasts the ways younger dyslexics and adults tend to approach reading. She points out that kids often rely more on phonemic awareness, that sounding out approach, while adults tend to use more meaning-based cues like morphology, looking at the different parts of words to figure out what they mean.
That's a really cool observation. And she gives this example sentence. The temple was deconstructed to remove the inner shrine. A younger reader might focus heavily on sounding out each syllable, temple was deconstructed, whereas an adult with dyslexia, using their larger vocabulary and knowledge of how language works, might pick up on the prefix D, meaning to undo, the root word construct, and that ade ending indicating past tense.
It really shows how adults leverage those language skills they develop later on to process text more efficiently. Especially because as adults, we often have to read so much more and so much faster. But it's not just about reading itself, right? Mikala also talks about the challenges some adults with dyslexia face when it comes to planning and organization.
Absolutely. As adults, we're juggling so many more responsibilities than we did when we were in school. Even something like, I don't know, making sure you feed yourself regularly. It seems simple, but it involves all these steps, right? Remembering to buy groceries, maybe making a shopping list, keeping track of what you already have at home, and that all relies heavily on working memory.
And that brings us to these really important concepts: executive functions and metacognition. Mikala explains executive functions as those higher-level cognitive skills, like self-control, being able to focus your attention, holding information in your working memory, and being flexible in your thinking. In metacognition, it's basically like thinking about your own thinking, It's that ability to plan how you'll approach a task, monitor how it's going, and adjust your strategies along the way.
Those are crucial mental skills for pretty much every aspect of life, both at home and at work. And Michaela emphasizes that tasks that require good planning and metacognitive skills, well, those are the kinds of tasks that dyslexic adults are often expected to perform.
So we really covered a lot of ground here, exploring the cognitive and emotional landscape of adult dyslexia, including, that often hidden weight of secrecy and stigma. So now let's move into the last part of Michaela's guide, where she focuses on some practical strategies for moving forward. And she begins by acknowledging that experiencing dyslexia as an adult isn't just about those cognitive differences. There's a huge emotional component as well.
So true. Often the first step in moving forward is really understanding those cognitive functions involved in reading and how dyslexia might be affecting them specifically for you. Like, do you find your working memory fades quickly? Do you often need to reread things? Do you ever notice things getting jumbled up out of order? Or do you find yourself skipping over words when you're reading?
And from that self-awareness, Michaela introduces this really helpful idea of compensating efficiently. It's about identifying those tasks that consistently trip you up, that cause you the most trouble. And then you can focus your energy on finding practical ways to make those specific tasks more manageable.
And she even brings up the 80-20 rule, which is also known as the Pareto principle, and applies it to dyslexia. The idea is that 80% of the positive impact on your life, on your satisfaction, might actually come from strategically focusing on just 20% of the challenges you're facing, like really honing in on those key areas where change can make the biggest difference.
And she shares this really powerful example from her own life, from her time in school. She talks about how using text-to-speech software, it wasn't just a way to work around her reading challenges. In many ways, it actually made her more efficient, even more effective than some of her peers who didn't have dyslexia.
That's such a great example. She pinpointed that one key area where she was struggling, accessing a ton of written material, and found this really effective strategy to compensate. And it turned into a real strength for her.
Exactly. And Mukalola also recommends focusing on developing planning and organizational skills as a really good starting point for many adults with dyslexia. Because those skills, they're so broadly applicable, whether at home or at work.
Right. They can make a huge difference.
And she really encourages people to focus on their strengths, really embrace and leverage those, while using their areas of weakness as sort of a roadmap, to guide where to direct their energy for improvement. And she argues that this approach can ultimately lead to greater confidence and a stronger sense of self-efficacy, which is so important.
Oh.
And then there's the really crucial and often complicated topic of support and deciding when or whether to disclose your dyslexia.
Yeah, that decision of when to share and who to share with, it's a really big one. And Mikala emphasizes that living with a condition that's often invisible to others and that still carries some stigma, it can take a real toll, mentally and emotionally. It can make you feel unsafe, misunderstood.
For sure. But she also highlights the incredibly positive impact that having a good support system can have, whether it's supportive family members, understanding friends, specialized social workers, or helpful work coaches. Having those people in your corner, people who get it, it can make a world of difference in your confidence and your overall well-being.
It really can.
And she also talks about the option of pursuing official dyslexia documentation. But sometimes that can be helpful for getting accommodations, accessing certain services, or even qualifying for funding. But she also gives this really important heads up about adult dyslexia evaluations. She says there isn't always a clear set of standards, consistent criteria for evaluation. So it's super important to find specialists who really have experience in assessing adults. It's a field that's still developing, still evolving.
It definitely is.
But in the end, Mikala brings it back to this core idea that individuals with dyslexia are the ultimate experts on their own experience. And she shares these 7 key themes that emerged from, like, real conversations with dyslexic adults about their lives. Things like ongoing challenges with organization, the importance of recognizing their own successes, how crucial support is, those feelings of being overwhelmed, all the emotional aspects, the desire to be acknowledged, the impact of negative memories from the past, anxieties about disclosing their dyslexia, and that strong desire to keep moving forward.
These themes, they come straight from the community, which makes them a really valuable starting point for anyone looking to understand their own experience or the experiences of someone they know. But Mikala also wisely reminds us that, reflecting on these themes, it can bring up some tough emotions, some difficult memories.
It makes sense. And she has this really practical suggestion, which is to create a portfolio of your achievements. It's a way to keep a tangible record of all that you've accomplished. And she argues that this can have a really positive effect on how you see yourself, boost your motivation, and give you a powerful form of self-validation, especially given all those extra challenges you've had to overcome. She suggests different ways to do this: a physical scrapbook, a digital collection, even a mind map. The key is that it's for you, a personal creation, no rules or expectations.
It's such a great way to celebrate your achievements and create a more positive narrative around your journey.
Absolutely. So congrats to you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of adult dyslexia. As we've seen, navigating dyslexia as an adult, it brings a wealth of personal experience and hard-won wisdom.
And really understanding your own experience with adult dyslexia is not just beneficial for you, it can also help those around you to better understand how dyslexia shows up and the ways in which it impacts your life.
Mikala makes it clear that dyslexic adults, they play a vital role in helping everyone understand dyslexia better, both on a personal level and as a bigger societal issue.
So we encourage you to keep learning, to share your experiences when you feel comfortable and safe doing so, and to really take pride in everything you've accomplished.
And here's a final thought for you to ponder. How could a deeper understanding of neurodiversity, including the often hidden realities of adult dyslexia, actually reshape our societal expectations? How could it help us create environments that are truly inclusive and equitable for everyone?
That's something to think about.
It really is.